Hello and welcome to another episode of Reviews Redux, where I take another look at one of my older reviews and bring it up to my more current quality standards. Today I'm taking another look at Quake IV for PC, Mac, Linux, and Xbox 360. What you're seeing here is the PC version. This is a first-person shooter and the fourth game in the Quake series, although it's a direct sequel to Quake II. It was developed by Raven Software and originally published by Activision, although of course Bethesda Softworks publishes it now, and it was released in 2005 for PC, Linux, and Xbox 360, with the Mac version coming out the following year. Upon its original release, it was pretty decently received, especially for its multiplayer, which was basically a slightly tweaked Quake III, so it's really not surprising that people liked the multiplayer. But of course these days you can't get into any matches in the multiplayer because Quake IV is completely dead. And since there's no bot support for it, I won't be showing you any multiplayer footage of Quake IV here because I simply can't do so. That's alright though, because unlike with Quake III, which was almost exclusively a multiplayer game and the single player mode was more or less just practice, in Quake IV there is an actual single player campaign, which really shouldn't be surprising given that it is a direct sequel to Quake II, and Quake II had a fairly lengthy single player campaign as well. The multiplayer was just an added bonus. But with Quake IV releasing almost a decade after the original Quake II, there is of course a question to be asked here, which is, how is this as a follow-up to Quake II? And a secondary question is, how is this in general as a Quake game? Well, let's just go ahead and start delving right into it and find out. And like always, we'll go ahead and start with the presentation, which runs on id Tech 4, the engine that powered Doom 3. Obviously, when Doom 3 came out, that was pretty impressive, especially in the lighting department, and Quake 4 is really no exception in that regard. The thing is that Half-Life 2 also released the same year that Doom 3 did, and it looked better in most regards. And that's also the case with Quake 4. You see, the real Achilles heel of the id Tech 4 engine is that it really only works best in really cramped corridors with a lot of very dark environments, and while that works fine for Doom 3, it's not really what you get with Quake 4. This opens up quite a bit more, even though there are still a lot of corridors and a lot of very dark environments. So whenever the game does put you into a more open area, the graphics do tend to suffer a fair bit. That's not to say that Quake IV looks bad for when it came out, it's just that it showcases one of the really weak points of its engine. And when you look at it from a modern perspective, it really hasn't aged all that well. But the real sticking point with the visuals is how poorly it compares to Quake II. You see, Quake II had a pretty specific look. It was a very industrial sci-fi look, and it had some very specific designs for all the enemies that you were fighting. They were all kind of horrifying mixes of flesh and machine, and it was basically like if you took the Borg and turned them into a proper horror movie aesthetic. And while Raven still did capture the same general vibe of if you took the Borg and turned them into a horror movie aesthetic kind of thing, they just don't look really much of anything like they did in Quake II, so it's a bit jarring to go from Quake II and have all these specific designs and then go to Quake IV, and nothing really looks like anything that you saw in the previous game, even though Quake IV takes place within the same day as Quake II. But it's not just the enemy designs or even the environmental designs that look barely anything, if anything at all, like their predecessors in Quake II. Even the weapons look absolutely nothing like they did in Quake II, and some of that is to the game's detriment. I mean, to give you a prime example, Quake II gave you a shotgun as well as a super shotgun, with the super shotgun being this incredibly powerful double-barreled shotgun, and the normal shotgun being a pump action that had a rotating drum magazine. In Quake IV, you get a shotgun, and it's a pump action where you have to load each individual shell like you would in a modern shotgun. But while that's one of the most glaring examples of this kind of thing, it's like that with all of the weapons. They look nothing like their Quake II counterparts, and there's not really any rhyme or reason why. I mean, even the designs of the Marines' armor and such just don't look like they did in Quake II, so I'm not really sure what they were going for with that. So while the graphics themselves look pretty solid for 2005, they just don't really have much continuity with Quake II, and that's just baffling. But then you move over into sound design, and that's where things really go all over the place. I mean, the gun and explosion sounds are actually pretty wimpy in this thing. They just don't have any punch to them, and they also have no real continuity with what we heard from the gun sounds in Quake II. That's not necessarily something I expected, but there are certain sounds in Quake II that have become somewhat iconic, and they just don't have representation in Quake IV. I mean, a prime example of that is the railgun. You shoot the railgun in Quake II and it sounds awesome. You shoot it in Quake IV and it just sounds absolutely pathetic. I mean, the gun and explosion sounds are so weak that a lot of the times the environmental sounds will drown them out. That's just sad. So the sounds of combat, which are a very important thing in a first-person shooter, are on the very weak side. But what about the other aspects of the sound design, like the voice acting and the music? Well, the voice acting in this is decent enough for 2005. I mean, it's nothing particularly great, but it's also not bad. But then there's the music, which is the biggest letdown of the entire presentation. Because you see, while a lot of people disagree on how much they like Quake II and whether it's a proper sequel to Quake and blah blah blah, one thing pretty much everybody agrees on is that the soundtrack of Quake II kicks all kinds of ass. It was done by a guy who goes by the moniker Sonic Mayhem, and it is a whole bunch of industrial and industrial metal that will never fail to get you pumped up. So what did they do for Quake IV? Did they continue that? Did they go for industrial metal? Did they go for a bit more atmospheric industrial like we got with, say, the original Quake? No, it's a generic sci-fi war movie soundtrack. It's all cinematic, orchestral kind of stuff, and it just sounds completely out of place in a Quake game, and it certainly sounds completely out of place in a follow-up to Quake II. And when you bring all of the presentation together, you end up with something where the voice acting is acceptable and the visuals look decent enough for the year they came out, but it's like Raven Software just didn't get the memo. But of course, what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, and the story in this takes place shortly after the events of Quake II. And the idea is that humanity has come into conflict with aliens known as the Strogg, operating from the planet Strogos. The Strogg are a horrifying mashup of flesh and machine. They take the bodies of their conquered enemies and experiment on them, chop them up, and repurpose them into things that can be beneficial to the Strogg themselves, and just generally be like if the Borg from Star Trek were made into a horror movie. After the first wave of troops went into Strogos in the events of Quake II, eventually there was a lone Marine, which was the player character in Quake II, that managed to take down the leader of the Strogg, the Macron. So now is the perfect time for the next wave of troops to attack, and you take on the role of one of those soldiers, Matthew Kane, a corporal that is assigned to Rhino's squad, and has something of a reputation that is never really explained to the player. On the way to Strogos, your dropship is shot down, and you end up having to regroup with your squad and go about the various objectives that you have, which will ultimately culminate in trying to go after the Strogg Nexus, their central network that, if destroyed, will basically leave the Strogg helpless. This mission ends up failing when the EMP that they're trying to use to shut down the Nexus doesn't manage to do so, and when trying to find alternate ways of shutting down the Nexus, Kane ends up encountering the Macron, the final boss of Quake II that has apparently been rebuilt out of nowhere, even though the time frame between Quake II and Quake IV is pretty much non-existent because they take place in the same day. Apparently the Strogg work really quickly when it comes to rebuilding their leader. At any rate, the Macron beats the crap out of Kane and captures him, and Kane undergoes the process of Stroggification, which is to say that he gets chopped up and has a bunch of cybernetic parts grafted onto him, but before the control chip in his brain is activated, he ends up getting rescued by fellow soldiers, and after you end up regrouping with your main forces, you undergo a new briefing where you are told that Kane is the new secret weapon that the forces of Earth are going to be using against the Strogg because he can get into places that the normal human Marines cannot, and thus you are launched back into the fray. From there, it's a matter of taking down the Strogg Nexus, taking down the Macron again, and ultimately setting the stage for humanity to win the war against the Strogg. It's all pretty simple and straightforward stuff, and the story is really not this game's strong suit. Of course, that's not really anything new for the Quake series. It's not like any of the previous games had much going on in the story department either, so it's really not that big of a deal. What is more of a big deal, however, is the way they tell that story, because that will also bring me directly into the gameplay, which is both the most important thing in Quake IV and the game's biggest flaw. Because you see, Quake IV is not a Quake game. Quake IV is a sci-fi military first-person shooter that happens to be set in the same universe as Quake II and follow the events of Quake II. Now, of course, when I say military shooter these days, you're immediately going to think, oh, it plays like Call of Duty, but that's not really what I'm talking about here. This is a military shooter from 2005, before that was an established subgenre that was dominated by the likes of Call of Duty. So there's no two-weapon limit or regenerating health or melee button or anything like that. You're still going to be collecting a full arsenal of weapons, you're still going to be having to find health and armor pickups, although they do something a bit different with that when you have squad mates, because you can also replenish your health and armor by talking to techs in the case of armor, or medics in the case of health, and they will replenish you up to full. And after you undergo stratification, you can utilize the Stroylant healing stations and click and hold on those to function more or less like the healing stations did in Doom 3. And over the course of the game, you're going to be fighting a variety of different enemy types, each of which has their own capabilities. Some of them will just run around and shoot at you, some of them will try to charge you and melee attack you, some of them will have a variety of things they can do, like the Centurions, who have an energy shield now instead of just having the shoulder-mounted railgun and then a melee attack. So that's still very much an old-school first-person shooter idea. But then they also throw in more military shooter ideas like needing to reload weapons, or having secondary fire functions like the scope in the case of the machine gun, where when you scope in, it will switch to semi-auto, but the bullets do more damage. And eventually you'll also get some upgrades for some of your weapons that will give them additional capabilities, like an upgrade for the nail gun that makes it shoot faster, and then a second upgrade that puts a scope on it, and then when you aim down the scope it will lock onto enemies and it will sort of track the nails to them. And while a lot of the weapons from Quake II do make a return, some of them are conspicuously absent. I mean, you have the selection of weapons in Quake IV being the blaster with infinite ammunition, and you can hold the attack button to charge it up. You have the machine gun, which I've already talked about. You have the shotgun, which I've also talked about. You have the hyper blaster, which in Quake II was basically an energy chain gun, whereas in Quake IV it's more just an energy machine gun. Then there's also that nail gun I mentioned, a grenade launcher, a rocket launcher, the railgun, and then finally two additional weapons that weren't in Quake II, but one of which was in previous Quake games, that being the lightning gun, which was in Quake I and Quake III. And then there's this game's replacement for the BFG. You see, in Quake II you had the BFG 10,000, but in Quake IV you get the dark matter gun, which launches a black hole at things. And unfortunately that is considerably less satisfying than it sounds for reasons that I'll explain in a moment. But there are two weapons from Quake II that are very conspicuous by their absence in Quake IV. Those are the chain gun and the super shotgun, both of which were absolute powerhouse weapons in Quake II but are just completely absent in Quake IV. And I'm not entirely sure why. About the best explanation I can think of is that they just thought they were redundant with other weapons that were already in the game. But whatever the case, the weapon lineup for Quake IV seems pretty solid on paper. The problem is in practice. Because something you will find out very quickly if you play Quake IV is that every single enemy you go up against is a bullet sponge. Even the basic grunt-type enemies will often take half a magazine of machine gun ammo to bring down. And the further you go into the game, the more spongy the enemies get. Now, in an old-school first-person shooter, this would be where you would whip out some of the power weapons, like the super shotgun or the rocket launcher or things like that, and just handily deal with them. But Quake IV doesn't play like that. Even the weapons you would think of as power weapons in Quake IV, like the lightning gun, or the railgun, or the rocket launcher, or the dark energy gun, usually take several hits to bring down even a basic enemy. And while you might think that that's entirely because I played through the game on the general difficulty, which is the hardest difficulty setting in the game, enemies are still bullet sponges even on lower difficulty settings. It's just that they do a hell of a lot less damage to you. This means that especially early in the game, when you don't have access to as many weapons as you do later on, you will very frequently find your ammo running quite low, just because you have to put so many rounds into enemies to bring them down. Now, on the one hand, that does emphasize the fact that the Strogg are a very dangerous adversary, but Quake II wasn't like that. You could take them down in fairly short order with the right weaponry. And Quake II was also a lot less stingy with the ammunition and health and armor pickups. Running low on ammo really wasn't a thing in Quake II, whereas in Quake IV it happens all the time. So between the wimpy weapon sounds and the relatively weak effect on target they have, they're just not very satisfying to use, which is a really nasty problem in a first-person shooter. But there's something far worse than just the weapons themselves feeling wimpy, and that is just how ridiculously slow you move until you get Stroggified. Because before you get to that point, you move so slowly that you just can't dodge anything. So you are constantly getting hammered by shot after shot, and on general difficulty, that means you are going down in a matter of milliseconds. You may think to yourself, oh, well that means the game's a good challenge on the higher difficulty settings. No, it means the game is bullshit on higher difficulty settings. If you have no reliable way of avoiding enemy attacks other than just hanging really far back and trying to peek out around a corner every so often, that's not really a matter of skill. That's a matter of either just being really patient or just getting lucky. And while there's always going to be some degree of luck in any first-person shooter, you don't want to be relying on luck almost exclusively just to avoid taking damage. And that's of course to say nothing of the many times you will get one-shot by enemies on the general difficulty, just out of nowhere and with absolutely nothing you can do about it. And the really sad part about this is, if the movement speed were actually like, say, Quake 1, 2, or 3, where you actually can move quite quickly, then this really wouldn't be a problem. And after the Stroggification, you do get a boost in speed, and that does help somewhat, but even then, you're still moving pretty slowly. You're basically going from the equivalent of being prone in a modern military shooter to slightly above walking speed in most old-school first-person shooters. And while that will actually make it feasible to avoid incoming enemy projectiles, there's still not really anything you can do about the hit scanners. And when you combine that slow movement speed with how spongy the enemies are and how weak the weapons feel, it makes the combat loop of Quake IV a mind-numbingly tedious slog at absolute best, and downright infuriating at absolute worst. And as if the combat itself weren't enough of a slog, a lot of the levels require you to just wait for your NPC allies to open doors, or flip switches, or all manner of other things. And while that wouldn't necessarily be that big of a deal if the combat was faster, since the combat is so slow and tedious, it makes the entire game slow and tedious. They do occasionally try to spice things up by giving you a turret sequence or throwing you into a vehicle like a hover tank or a mech, and while those are interesting thematically, the controls for those vehicles are pretty clunky. The mech in particular is pretty wonky because you move quite a bit faster when you're strafing, so you end up doing this weird strafe shuffle to move around more quickly, and that tends to leave you more open to being attacked by enemies, and also has a nasty habit of getting you stuck on the scenery an awful lot. And unlike the main portion of the game where you're running around on foot, the vehicles do actually have regenerating health, and it regenerates pretty quickly, so there's really nothing that actually poses much of a threat to you, and they end up being not much more than glorified turret sequences. The end result of all of this is that Quake IV ends up playing basically like a military shooter rather than an actual Quake game, and even if you look at it only as a military sci-fi shooter and not as a Quake game, it's still just absolutely awful, and I have absolutely no idea why people seem to like it as much as they do. And the fact that Raven Software are the ones that developed it is all the more shocking. They should have known what they were doing, and instead we got this absolute mess of a first-person shooter that is just not a Quake game. At least, not in the single player anyway. The multiplayer is definitely like Quake, because it's basically just Quake 3 multiplayer, but ported over into the new engine. Unfortunately though, the multiplayer of Quake 4 is now effectively unplayable unless you set up a LAN or something. So unfortunately I can't show off any of the multiplayer gameplay, but if you're familiar with Quake 3, then Quake 4's multiplayer is going to be very familiar to you as well. It's just with some different weapons that are related to Quake 4, as opposed to the standard lineup you have with Quake 3. It really is just classic Quake-style arena shooter gameplay that has been brought into the Doom 3 engine. But of course, then the question is, why bother with Quake 4's multiplayer when you can play Quake 3's multiplayer? Obviously, these days, that's really not much of a question because Quake 3 is also unplayable. But I think Quake Live is actually still up and running, and there's always Quake Champions as well, although it has its own host of problems. Now, the simple reality is that if you weren't playing Quake 4 for its single player primarily, then there wasn't really much reason to play Quake 4. And if you judge it on its single player, then it is absolutely awful and is just not worth playing. Overall, unfortunately, I have to give Quake 4 a 1 out of 5. It is easily the worst game in the Quake franchise, and frankly, it's just not a Quake game. And on a personal level, the fact that this is the sequel to Quake II, my personal favorite in the Quake series, just adds insult to injury. But even if Quake II weren't my favorite in the series, this would still be a 1 out of 5. It is a terrible game. Thank you all very much for watching, and if you like my videos, please consider supporting the channel on Patreon. All the revenue from that goes directly back into the channel, whether it be getting more games for review, or replacing broken equipment, or getting new equipment, or whatever the case may be. If you can't afford to or don't want to, that is perfectly fine. I understand. But the option's there if you're interested. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you all in later videos.